Welcome back everyone. Today, we're continuing with the next part of this series, called What If Goku Remembered the Saiyans? My name is Ash. Please, for me, drop a like and subscribe to the page. Also leave your comments down below. With that, let's begin. Vegeta's vision blurred as Kakarot released the energy blast, the glowing sphere racing toward him like a meteor. He staggered to his feet, disoriented and battered. Dodging wasn't an option. He was too slow in his current state. His instincts, honed by years of battle, told him this wasn't a bluff. Kakarot wasn't holding back. If he couldn't counter this, it was over. He gritted his teeth and raised his hands, palms forward, bracing for impact. The blast slammed into him with a force that felt like the weight of an entire planet. His arms screamed in protest, the energy scorching his palms and numbing his muscles. The sheer power of the attack drove him backward, his boots digging trenches into the ground. The dirt and rock beneath him crumbled as he struggled to hold his position, his body trembling under the strain. This isn't enough, Vegeta thought desperately. His mind raced as the blast pushed him closer to the edge. He needed more power. Far more power if he wanted to survive. He considered a technique he'd seen Kakarot and the humans use before, a way to temporarily boost power by borrowing energy from others. But something about it had always seemed wrong. That power wouldn't truly be his. Vegeta had always prided himself on his strength being his own, but pride was meaningless if he was dead. Gritting his teeth, Vegeta thought back to the years he'd spent on the edge of despair. There had been times, after the destruction of his planet, when he'd wanted to die. Times when survival felt like an empty chore. He'd worn his cold, unfeeling demeanor like armor, a shield to get through the endless missions and battles. But now he had something to live for. Images flashed through his mind. His mate, her unwavering support, the daughter he hadn't thought he could care for, but now meant everything. He wasn't going to let them down. Not now. Not ever. With a guttural roar, Vegeta threw everything he had into the fight. His muscles strained, his energy surged, and he felt something inside him crack, then shatter. Power flooded through him, fierce and unrelenting, like a dam breaking and releasing a raging river. His aura exploded outward, a golden light engulfing him, as his hair stood on end and shifted to a brilliant gold. The energy blast that had been driving him back slowed, then reversed. With a final push, Vegeta hurled the blast skyward, where it detonated harmlessly in the clouds. Kakarot floated above, watching with a grin. "I knew you could do it," he said, his voice filled with pride. Vegeta didn't waste words. He phased in front of Kakarot in an instant, his fist connecting solidly with the taller Saiyan's jaw. The punch barely phased Kakarot, but it made its point. "That's for trying to kill me," Vegeta said, his tone icy, but his breathing ragged. "You're welcome," Kakarot replied with a grin, completely unbothered. Vegeta grunted, crossing his arms. Despite himself, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. He had achieved what he'd been chasing for so long, Super Saiyan, but he wasn't about to thank a low-class warrior for it. "I've got another surprise for you," Kakarot said, breaking into Vegeta's thoughts. Before Vegeta could respond, Kakarot disappeared, his instant transmission technique leaving nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. He reappeared seconds later with someone by his side, a young girl, her dark eyes wide as she looked up at Vegeta. Kakarot smiled. "Vegeta, I'd like you to meet Celia." The name struck Vegeta like a bolt of lightning. He blinked, his golden aura flickering as he took in the sight of her. Of course, he recognized the name instantly. He was the one who had insisted on it. After all, if his daughter was going to be a princess, she needed a true Saiyan name, even if she was half human. "Hi, father," Celia said, her voice steady, but carrying a warmth that took Vegeta by surprise. He stared at her, the disbelief clear on his face. "How?" was all he managed to say, his sharp mind reeling. "I'm from the future," Celia explained calmly, her expression unwavering. "I came back to help with the android threat." Suddenly, everything clicked in Vegeta's mind. That's how Kakarot knew about the impending danger. Of course, it all made sense now. "Don't worry," Vegeta said, his confidence surging as his golden aura flickered around him. "I won't let the androids hurt my family. And now that I've become a Super Saiyan, those metallic pests will be nothing but scrap." Celia frowned slightly. "You were a Super Saiyan in my time too," she said. "The androids still killed you, Kakarot, and rotted." Vegeta froze for a moment, processing her words. Then he laughed, his signature cocky smirk returning. "I guess I'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen this time," he said. "I want to train with you, father," Celia said, her tone both respectful and determined. "I promise I won't slow you down." Vegeta studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes narrowing as he assessed her energy. She wasn't particularly strong compared to him, but there was potential there, raw, untapped power waiting to be developed. He'd sensed it even when she was born, her energy higher than most half-Saiyans. And now, standing before him, she was already stronger than he had been at her age. "What training have you had?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Not much," Celia admitted, looking slightly embarrassed. "After you were killed by the androids, Mom didn't want me to train. She was scared they'd come for me too." Vegeta paused, his expression hardening. The thought of his daughter being vulnerable, unable to defend herself, didn't sit well with him. He didn't want her fighting machines built to kill, but he wanted even less for her to grow up weak and unprepared. "All right," Vegeta said finally. "We'll start training tomorrow." His smirk returned. "By now, your mother will have dinner ready." Celia's face brightened, but Vegeta's grin wasn't just for her. After the intense day he'd had, he figured he'd earned a break, and it wouldn't hurt to spend some time getting to know his future daughter. Out in the woods, Bardock's fists flew through the air, each punch sharper and faster than the last. His gravity belt was dialed up to 200 times Earth's gravity, every move an exercise in endurance and strength. Sweat poured down his face as he pushed himself, determination etched into his features. For the past year, Bardock had thrown himself into training, chasing the elusive Super Saiyan transformation his father said he was close to achieving. But close wasn't good enough. A soft rush of displaced air signaled Kakarot's arrival. The older warrior appeared a few feet away, arms crossed, as he watched his son's relentless practice. Bardock stopped mid-punch, turning to acknowledge him. "How'd it go with Vegeta?" he asked, panting slightly from the exertion. "Well," Kakarot said, a small grin tugging at his lips. "He survived, and he transformed." "That's good," Bardock said, nodding approvingly. "Too bad it didn't work when you tried it on me." Kakarot sighed. "I just couldn't make a blast powerful enough to push you to your limit," he admitted. "You've mastered the Kaioken, so even the one I used on Vegeta wouldn't have been enough. You'd have deflected it easily." "Then why not try a stronger one?" Bardock complained, frustration creeping into his voice. "Son," Kakarot said, his voice gentle but firm, "we've been over this. As much as I want you to become a Super Saiyan, I don't want to risk seriously hurting you. If I unleashed something that strong, and you couldn't block it," he trailed off, shaking his head, "I might not be able to stop it in time." "But Dad," Bardock pressed, his fists clenching at his sides, "I need to become a Super Saiyan if I'm going to help fight the androids. There are 5 of them. You, Vegeta, and Raditz won't be enough." Kakarot sighed again, his expression darkening slightly. "I know," he admitted. "I've already started to feel like I've hit a wall in my own training." Bardock frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked. Kakarot stood quietly for a moment, his golden hair shimmering as he maintained his Super Saiyan form. His hands were relaxed at his sides, though his brow furrowed slightly in thought. "Well," he began, breaking the silence, "as hard as I've been training, I haven't gotten much stronger." Bardock's eyes widened slightly. "But you're the strongest in the universe," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Maybe it's because you don't have a real challenge to fight." "That could be it," Kakarot admitted, "but it doesn't change the fact that I need to be stronger when the androids arrive. What we're up against, it's not going to be easy." "You can't do this alone, Dad," Bardock said, stepping closer. His voice was firm, but there was an edge of urgency to it. "I know you want to protect me, but I can help. I'm not a kid anymore." Kakarot sighed, a small smile softening his expression. "I know, son," he said gently. "You're strong, and I'm proud of how far you've come. At least this time, though, we'll have Trunks to help us too." Bardock nodded, his determination growing. "That gives us 4 Super Saiyans," but he hesitated for a moment before continuing. "We'll need a 5th to take on the androids. With how strong they are, it won't be enough otherwise." Kakarot chuckled softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, I get it," he said. "You're not gonna let this go, are you? I'll try again to push you to become a Super Saiyan." "Thanks, Dad," Bardock said, a grin spreading across his face. Without wasting a second, he ran a short distance away, planting his feet firmly on the ground. Turning back, he raised his hands and steadied himself. "I'm ready." Kakarot stepped forward, the golden aura around him flaring brighter as he summoned energy into his hands. The blast he began to form was massive, far larger than the one he'd used on Vegeta earlier. He knew this one had to be stronger, strong enough to push Bardock past his limit. With a grunt, Kakarot hurled the glowing orb of energy forward. It streaked across the distance between them, obliterating trees and foliage in its path, a streak of golden destruction. Bardock braced himself, his hands meeting the blast as his aura flared red with the power of Kaioken. The impact was immense, the force of the blast slamming into Bardock like a tidal wave. His boots dug deep into the ground, creating trenches as he slid back under the pressure. "Come on," Bardock shouted, gritting his teeth as he pushed against the attack. The power of Kaioken surged through him, increasing to X30 as he tried to hold his ground. But it wasn't enough. The blast continued to drive him back, unrelenting in its intensity. Sweat poured down Bardock's face as he pushed harder, his mind racing. If I can't stop this, what happens when the androids come? He thought of the devastation they would bring, the lives they would destroy. His mind flashed to Trunks, the hardness in his future brother's eyes. It was the look of someone who had witnessed too much death. I can't let that happen to him. Trunks deserves a world where he can just be a kid. I have to be stronger for him, for everyone. Bardock's red aura began to shimmer, faint streaks of gold flickering at the edges. His teeth clenched as his muscles tensed, every ounce of energy being pushed to its limits. His hair began to shift, flashing between its natural blue-black hue and brilliant gold. "Come on!" he shouted again, his voice raw with effort. With one final surge, Bardock's hair exploded into a permanent golden glow, and his eyes turned turquoise. His red aura shifted completely. Now a bright golden flame surrounding him. He had done it. He was a Super Saiyan. But the battle wasn't over. Even with his newfound strength, the blast was still pushing him back. Kakarot had made it strong enough to challenge him, and it wasn't about to be overpowered easily. Bardock's eyes narrowed, his determination flaring alongside his energy. He pushed back against the blast with everything he had, his hands trembling under the strain, realizing brute force wasn't enough. Bardock gathered his energy into his palms and released his own attack. The golden beam shot forward, colliding with Kakarot's blast in a dazzling explosion of light and power. The explosion roared through the forest, flattening trees and leaving a massive crater that stretched for miles. Smoke billowed into the air, obscuring the battlefield in a haze of gray. Kakarot floated above the destruction, his golden aura flickering faintly as he scanned the ground below. As the smoke cleared, his eyes landed on Bardock, who stood at the epicenter of the devastation. Though battered and bruised, the young Saiyan managed to lift his hand, offering a thumbs up to his father before his body gave out. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious, his golden hair fading back to its natural blue-black hue. Kakarot descended quickly, landing beside his son. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "You did it, Bardock," he said quietly. "You've come so far." He lifted the boy gently, cradling him in his arms. "Rest up, you've earned it." Celia stretched lazily as the alarm clock's beeping stirred her from sleep. For a moment, she lay in bed, savoring the silence. It felt strange, peaceful even, to sleep without the ever-present fear of an android attack. In her future, the bunkers were hidden and secure, but there was always a lingering tension, a sense that discovery was only a matter of time. The smell of breakfast wafted into her room, breaking her train of thought. In a flash, she was out of bed and in the kitchen, where she wasted no time devouring a plate of food. Chi-Chi glanced over from the stove, shaking her head with a small smile. "That'll take some getting used to," she said, watching Celia wolf down her meal with the ferocity typical of a Saiyan. "Sorry," Celia mumbled around a mouthful of food. She swallowed quickly and added, "It's just been a while since I've had anything this good. In the future, food like this is hard to come by." Chi-Chi's expression softened. "It's okay, darling," she said gently. "I can only imagine how hard things must have been for you." Celia paused, glancing up at her mother, or rather, the younger version of her mother. It was surreal seeing her this way, so full of life and energy. The Chi-Chi she knew in her own time was worn down, aged far beyond her years by loss and the constant threat of the androids. "Where's father?" Celia asked, breaking the momentary silence. "Oh, the usual," Chi-Chi replied with a shrug. "He ate breakfast faster than you and ran off to train." Celia frowned. "He was supposed to train me today?" Chi-Chi laughed lightly. "He always leaves early," she said. "Don't worry about it, though. Maybe I can show you a thing or two. I might not be as strong as you, Saiyans, but I know my way around a fight." Celia's jaw dropped in surprise. Was this the same woman who raised me? She wondered. Her future mother had been adamant about forbidding her from training, doing everything in her power to keep her away from combat. Yet here she was, casually offering to spar. "Sure, that'd be great," Celia said, trying to hide her amazement. A few hours later, Celia and Chi-Chi stood in a grassy field, not far from the house. The air was crisp, and the sun shone brightly overhead, bathing the landscape in warmth. "I've always liked training outside," Chi-Chi said, as she stretched her arms. "I don't know why your father insists on spending so much time in that gravity room. Sometimes, you just have to enjoy the fresh air while you can." Celia chuckled. "I guess you have a point," she said. Her eyes wandered to a nearby bouncer, where her younger self sat, babbling and kicking her tiny feet in the sunlight. It was still strange seeing herself as a baby, but she knew she'd get used to it eventually. She had 2 years in this timeline to prepare for the androids. Her mother's advice echoed in her mind. Maybe she should enjoy this peaceful time, at least a little. But training came first. Reaching into the bag she'd brought along, Celia pulled out the gravity belt Bulma had given her. The sleek device gleamed in the sunlight as she buckled it around her waist. With a press of a button, her personal gravity field activated, increasing to 20 times Earth's gravity. Her knees buckled slightly as the weight pressed down on her, but she adjusted quickly, straightening up with a determined smile. "All right, Mom," she said, her voice steady. "Show me what you've got." Celia adjusted the gravity belt at her waist, feeling the increased pressure settle over her body. She stretched her arms, getting used to the added weight. Chi-Chi, standing nearby, eyed the device curiously. "What's that?" Chi-Chi asked, gesturing to the sleek belt. "Oh, this?" Celia said, glancing down. "It's something Bulma made. It lets the wearer increase the gravity around them, makes training a lot tougher." Chi-Chi tilted her head, clearly impressed. "That's pretty neat. I take it your father doesn't know about it? If he did, I'm sure he'd already have one." Celia laughed, imagining it. "Yeah, but he'd probably try to combine it with the gravity room and end up overdoing it." Chi-Chi chuckled along with her. "That does sound like Vegeta," she said, shaking her head. "But even with all his faults, I do love him." Her tone softened for a moment before her expression turned playful. "Speaking of love, do you have any prospects?" Celia froze, her cheeks heating up as she tried and utterly failed to keep her blush from showing. She glanced away, but Chi-Chi had already caught it. "Who is he?" Chi-Chi teased, a knowing smile spreading across her face. "I know that look." "Promise you won't tell father?" Celia asked, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "This is girl talk," Chi-Chi said with a wink, "and the first rule of girl talk is we don't talk about it to men." Celia hesitated, but then sighed. She was still getting used to this relaxed, open version of her mother. In her own timeline, Chi-Chi had always been focused on survival, not gossip or playful conversations. "All right," she said, her voice soft. "His name is Trunks." Chi-Chi's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what does this Trunks do for a living?" "He's a fighter," Celia replied. "With the androids running rampant, that's about the only option left." "I see," Chi-Chi said thoughtfully, nodding. "I can understand why you wouldn't want your father to know. I can already imagine him challenging this Trunks to a fight." Celia sighed again, shaking her head. "Yeah, that would be awkward." She didn't doubt Trunks could handle her father in a fight, but the situation would still be tense. Another thought crossed her mind. If they managed to defeat the androids and restore their timeline, she might not even have to explain any of this to Vegeta. Shaking off the thought, Celia shifted into a fighting stance. "Speaking of fighting, didn't we come here to spar?" "We did," Chi-Chi said, grinning as she mirrored her daughter's stance. "Let's see what you've got." Meanwhile, Krillin touched down on Master Roshi's island, scanning the familiar surroundings. Yamcha was on the beach, running through basic martial arts stances, while Roshi lounged in a chair nearby, predictably engrossed in one of his magazines. "Hey guys," Krillin called out as he landed. "Krillin," Yamcha said, pausing mid-stance to wave. "Glad you're here. I was just doing a warm-up. I could use a sparring partner if I'm going to stand a chance against the androids." Krillin smiled, but shook his head. "Actually, I've got a plan for that," he said. "Are Tien and Chieyatsu coming?" "Yeah," Yamcha replied, grabbing a towel to wipe his face. "They should be here soon. But why'd you insist on Chieyatsu coming? He hasn't really fought much since the old tournament days." Krillin's grin widened. "Well, I've been working on a new technique," he said. "It's something I picked up from King Kai after, well, the last time I was killed by Frieza." "What kind of technique?" Yamcha asked. His curiosity piqued. "Fusion," Krillin replied, the word hanging in the air. "Fusion?" Yamcha repeated, confused. "You mean like what Piccolo did on Namek?" "Sort of," Krillin said. "It has a similar effect on power, but this version only lasts for 30 minutes. It's something I learned from the Metamoran people." Yamcha's eyes lit up. "So, if Tien and I fused, and you and Chieyatsu fused, you think we'd be strong enough to take on the androids?" Krillin shrugged. "I don't know for sure," he admitted, but the Metamoran people got insanely strong using this technique. It might give us the edge we need. Yamcha nodded, his confidence building. Sounds great. Those androids won't know what hit them. Let's just hope Tien and Chiyozu are up for it, Krillin said, looking toward the horizon. We've got work to do. 2 years later, Kakarot adjusted the sash of his Jai, tightening it securely around his waist. His gaze shifted toward the window, where the early morning sun cast long shadows over the horizon. Today was the day. The androids were coming. After 2 grueling years of training, he could only hope they had done enough to prepare for the battle ahead. Bardock, Trunks, he called, his voice firm yet calm. It's time to go. The androids should show up in a few hours. Bardock stretched his arms lazily, leaning against the doorframe. What's the rush, Dad? He asked with a grin. You've got instant transmission. We could be there in a second. Besides, Bulma added, stepping into the room with a teasing smile, I won't have my boys fighting the androids on an empty stomach. At the mention of food, Kakarot's resolve wavered. His stomach growled, as if in agreement. I guess we have a little time, he conceded with a sheepish laugh. In another part of Capsule Corp, Chi-Chi set plates of breakfast on the table, barely able to keep up with the voracious appetites of Vegeta and Celia. They devoured the food as fast as she could prepare it, the dishes piling up in the sink like a culinary battlefield. Though she put on a strong front, Chi-Chi's heart was heavy. Today, her husband and daughter would face the androids, and while she knew how powerful they were, it didn't make the fear go away. She could only hope their training had made them strong enough. Mom? Dad? Celia said suddenly, setting her fork down. Her tone was nervous, yet resolute. What is it, honey? Chi-Chi asked, glancing over as Vegeta continued eating, seemingly oblivious to his daughter's words. Celia hesitated, fidgeting slightly. She'd been dreading this moment for weeks, but now there was no time left to stall. She had to tell them. I'm not going to fight the androids with you, she said finally. Chi-Chi blinked, her brow furrowing. What? But you've trained so hard, darling. Vegeta snorted, not even looking up from his plate. There won't be any left after I've had my turn with them anyway, he said, shoving another mouthful of food into his mouth. Celia ignored her father's comment and cleared her throat, her hands tightening into fists on the table. Well, she began hesitantly. Then, with a deep breath, she blurted it out. I'm pregnant. The sound of Vegeta spitting his food across the table was almost comical, if not for the murderous glare that followed. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. Who? He growled. The single word carried all the menace of a royal decree. Celia held his gaze, unflinching. She knew exactly what he meant. His name is Trunks, she said evenly. He's Kakarot's second son. He came back from the future with me to help fight the androids. Vegeta's face darkened. His aura flared faintly, making the silverware on the table rattle. He's dead, he declared, his tone ice cold. Now, dear, Chi-Chi interrupted, her voice calm but firm, as she placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. Don't go overboard. I've talked with Celia a lot over the past 2 years, and you need to let her make her own decisions. She's a grown woman. I'm not going to kill her, Vegeta said, his teeth gritted. Just a little punk who dared touch my little girl? Celia rolled her eyes, but kept her composure. I'll have you know, I'm 20 years old, she said, her tone unwavering. I'm not exactly a little, and Trunks has been there for me through everything. We love each other. Vegeta's fiery retort died on his lips as he met his daughter's gaze. Her words carried a gravity that cut through his bluster. For all his pride and ferocity, Vegeta couldn't deny the strength of her conviction. He let out a long, slow breath, his fists unclenching. All right, he said begrudgingly. I won't kill him, but I'll make him wish he were dead. After the androids, Chi-Chi reminded him sharply, giving him a warning look. She knew her husband too well. He wouldn't actually hurt Trunks, but the last thing they needed was a fight breaking out between 2 Super Saiyans before the real battle. Vegeta grunted in acknowledgement. After the androids, he promised, though the faint smirk on his face hinted that Trunks wouldn't get off too easily. Celia sighed in relief, her lips twitching into a small smile, despite herself. Thanks, Dad, she said softly.